Long before the first drops of rain fell from the sky, before the thunder roared and the earth opened in fury, the Lord had already beheld the corruption of mankind. Man, who had been created in the image of God, had turned away from righteousness and plunged into wickedness. Violence spread like poison, and the thoughts of the human heart were constantly evil. The creation that had once been called very good now groaned under the weight of sin. But even in the midst of such decay, God's eyes fell upon a different man, Noah. Noah was righteous, upright in his generation. While the world mocked holiness, he walked with God. His life was a silent testimony, a living contrast to the darkness around him. It was to this man that God revealed his plan, not a plan of destruction but of redemption. For though judgment was necessary, grace still wanted to preserve life. God commanded Noah to build an ark, not just as a shelter but as a sign that mercy still existed even in the face of justice. The instructions were clear. The ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits high. Converted to our standard system of measurements, that would be about 445 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 44 feet high. It was a colossal vessel, nearly the size of a football field and as tall as a 4-story building. An impossible feat for the time. There were no cranes, power tools, naval engineering, or digital technology. But what is impossible for man is the realm in which God works with perfection. Noah began the work in obedience, even though he saw no signs of what was to come. For approximately 120 years, he worked with dedication, sustained by faith. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, grew up in the construction environment, helping with their wives to build the vessel that would one day house all the hope of the world. There were no crowds to help, no hired experts, just 8 people guided by the certainty that God was faithful. Gopher, in the biblical text. To this day, scholars debate what species this was. Some argue that it was cypress, others suggest cedar, or even a variety that may have become extinct. But everyone agrees on one thing. It was a wood that was resistant to moisture, light and durable. The right material prepared by the Creator to withstand months in rough waters. Each piece was sealed with bitumen, a type of natural pitch, applied both inside and outside the structure, ensuring the vessel's waterproofness. The ark was not designed to sail like a normal ship. It had no rudder or sails. Its function was to float and resist. It was a gigantic stable box with proportions considered ideal even by the standards of modern naval engineering. Being 6 times longer than it was wide, provided the balance needed to avoid capsizing. Contemporary experts admit that this simple but effective design would have been able to withstand waves over 30 meters high without capsizing. The ark's interior was also a work of genius. It was probably built with transverse and longitudinal structural divisions, forming a network of compartments. These spaces reinforced the rigidity of the hull and allowed for better organization of the animals, supplies, and activities of Noah's family. Maximum use was made of the interior volume with no wide corridors or useless spaces. Everything had a reason, a purpose, and a balance. The construction site also didn't seem to make sense to human eyes. Far from seas, ports, or navigable rivers, the ark grew on dry ground. People passed by and laughed. They called Noah crazy. They said nothing would happen. But Noah didn't build to please men. He built because he trusted God. What the scoffers did not understand was that it was not logic that guided that hammer, but faith. And faith always seems crazy until the rain starts falling. Each hammer blow was a sermon, each raised board a warning. The ark was not just wood, it was also a testament to God's patience in delaying judgment while Noah preached, even if only by gestures, the truth. The building was, for decades, a visible altar of fidelity, a message for everyone who would listen. But the world closed its ears. They continued eating, drinking, marrying, as if eternity was not at the door. And when the last piece was fitted together, the ark stood before the world as a fortress of salvation. Its size was imposing, its structure was firm, its interior was ready. But more than all of this, it represented the heart of a God who, even in the face of wrath, still preserves life. A God who, seeing the end of all things, was already preparing a new beginning. As the ark stood in all its grandeur, ready to fulfill its role in the divine plan, a new challenge presented itself: to gather and accommodate the immense variety of creatures that God had chosen to preserve. This was the next phase of the heavenly project, and again, it was not the work of human strength, but of the direct intervention of the Creator. Noah did not have to go on expeditions into forests or deserts. He did not set traps or assemble search caravans. God moved the animals. They came to the ark, driven by an impulse that went beyond instinct. It was the voice of creation responding to the call of its Creator. 2 by 2, the creatures arrived. From the plains, the valleys, the mountains and caves, a silent and sacred procession formed toward the refuge of salvation. There was order in it all, no confusion. The animals approached, guided not by maps or trails, but by an invisible direction that only the God of life could command. And so they began to enter, species by species, as the Lord had commanded. But there was a deep secret to the number of these creatures. God did not command millions of species, as many people think. In his wisdom, the Lord instructed Noah to preserve the kinds of each animal, not the countless modern variations. The Bible uses the word min, which represents the basic groups created by God, not the current scientific classifications. For example, a single pair of canines would be enough to produce over time wolves, domestic dogs, foxes, and coyotes. Instead of dozens of felines, one pair of felines would suffice. So the actual number of animals on the ark was much smaller than we imagine. Studies based on this view indicate that about 1,000 major types of land animals and birds were needed. Considering that God commanded 2 of each, male and female, and 7 pairs of so-called clean animals, such as oxen, sheep, and doves, this number would increase to about 6,800 individuals, a figure that is fully acceptable within the dimensions of the ark. Even more so if we consider that, wisely, most of the animals taken were puppies or young animals. They took up less space, ate less, and were easier to care for during the months that would follow. Their entry also followed a functional logic. The larger, heavier animals, such as oxen and camels, were placed on the lower floor of the ark. This decision helped to keep the vessel's center of gravity lower, contributing to its stability even in the midst of the roughest waves. The middle floor was reserved for medium-sized animals, such as tapirs, deer, pigs, and capybaras. The third level, closest to the upper openings, received birds, small rodents, and reptiles and amphibians, housed in environments adapted to their specific needs. Not at each sector was organized with precision. Carnivores and herbivores were not placed together, avoiding conflicts and instinctive predators. The areas with the most fragile animals had natural temperature and humidity regulation, using water reservoirs, straw, and other materials that maintained the appropriate environment. The birds were housed in wooden cage structures, secured and ventilated, so that they could breathe and move around safely. The reptiles, many of which required constant heat, were positioned near areas with natural light and protected from the wind. There was also space reserved for food. Hay, grains, seeds, dried fruits, and roots were organized in a practical way, with easy access. Each type of animal received its portion, carefully measured and controlled. Even the food of the carnivores was prepared in a simple way and preserved, probably by drying or smoking. And most notably, all of this supply was stored before the arrival of the waters. Nothing was improvised. Everything had been planned months, perhaps years, In advance, always under the direction of God, Noah and his family attended to every detail with obedience and patience. There was no room for neglect. Each animal was important, for it represented not only a species, but a future. It was the continuity of creation that was being protected, a sacred responsibility given by God to the righteous man. What seemed like a simple mission of lodging was, in fact, a service of the highest honor and trust. And there was something even more extraordinary about the whole operation, the absence of panic. No escape, no rebellion among the animals. It was as if everyone, even the wild ones, knew they were there for a greater purpose. Lions, lambs, eagles, rabbits, all living under the same wooden roof, respecting each other's space, waiting for the promise of a new beginning. The peace inside was not natural, it was divine. The world outside ignored the signs. Noah's laughter of the construction of the gathered animals, but inside the ark, a deep reverence reigned. Everything was ready. The wood had been cut, the compartments filled, the food stored, the creatures gathered together. The final phase was about to begin. And then, with the gentleness and sovereignty of God himself, the door of the ark was closed, not by the hands of Noah, but by the hands of the Most High. When the Lord closed the door of the ark, a new time began on earth, a time of judgment for those outside and a time of preservation for those inside. The sky broke, the heavenly windows were opened, the earth split open, and from the depths gushed forth springs of water, unlike any other known to man. The flood was not just a long rain, it was a cosmic disruption, a divine intervention that covered mountains, forests, cities, and deserts. While everything sank beneath the waters, the ark, silent and obedient, began to float. It did not sail on known seas, nor did it have a rudder, sail, or human direction. It was guided by God himself. It floated on the waters of judgment, but it carried within itself the hope of a new creation. And there, in that world, closed by boards and sealed by faith, life had to go on. The coexistence of more than 6,000 animals and a small family of 8 people was a gigantic mission. But the same God who ordered the construction and brought the animals also empowered his servants to keep everything in order. The inner workings of the ark were surprisingly sophisticated, even without any modern gadgets. One of the biggest challenges was feeding all the animals for more than a year without the food spoiling. God had instructed Noah to stockpile food suitable for each type of creature in advance. Grains, seeds, roots, dried fruits, and hay filled the lower compartments. The food was organized in clay or wooden containers, protected from moisture and contamination. It was an impressive logistical task, and it was all done by hand. To facilitate distribution, it is believed that Noah and his sons created simple but ingenious systems. Large pots with regulated openings released food, little by little. Channels, dug in the ground, lined with straw, allowed the grains to reach several cages at the same time. Everything was done with economy and planning. Nothing was wasted. And even among carnivorous animals, portions were rationed and treated in such a way as to preserve the meat for as long as possible, perhaps through drying in the sun or smoking. It before the flood, but in addition to hunger there was thirst. The ark was surrounded by water, but it was dirty water, full of mud, debris, salt, and impurities. So Noah's family depended on a rainwater collection system. Upper areas of the ark collected clean water and directed it to internal cisterns. This water was then filtered with layers of sand, charcoal, and gravel, a technique known even among ancient peoples. From there, it was carried by gravity to smaller reservoirs spread throughout the vessel. In this way, the animals had constant access to drinking water, without the need for constant effort from the caretakers. Another unavoidable challenge was the accumulation of waste. With thousands of animals confined, The volume of waste generated daily was enormous, but God, in his wisdom, also inspired solutions. The compartments where the animals were housed were built with gently sloping floors. These floors led the waste to side channels, which in turn carried the material to reservoirs located at the lower ends of the ark. At certain times, these areas could be opened to discharge the accumulation directly into the floodwaters, far from the hull and in complete safety. In addition to the physical structure, there was also a need for lighting. During the first 40 days, when it rained non-stop, it was always dark. For this reason, the interior of the ark had lamps made of clay, fueled by olive oil or animal fat. These soft flames illuminated the corridors and the deepest rooms. It was not a strong light, but it was enough to maintain the routine and allow for the care of the animals. The maintenance of these lamps was done daily, in turns, by the family members. Noah and his family also had a reserved space inside the ark. Somewhere on the upper floor was a secluded compartment where they could rest, pray, and eat. Although simple, this space was a refuge within a refuge. It was there that they renewed their strength, reflected on the days, and kept their hearts firm in God's promises. Because more than physical tasks, there was an invisible battle being fought, that of discouragement, doubt, fear of the unknown. But the faith that sustained them in raising the ark was the same that sustained them now on the high seas. Routine was essential. Each day followed a cycle of tasks: feeding the animals, refilling their water, removing waste, checking their health, maintaining light and hygiene, and spending time with the family. There was no room for laziness, but there was also no room for despair. Everything was done in order. Discipline was the bridge between external chaos and internal peace. Time seemed to stretch on forever. With each dawn, a new weight. With each dusk, the renewal of hope. There were no windows to the world. There was no news, no calendars, no forecast. But there was one certainty. God was there. Not just as a distant creator, but as a constant presence. It was he who sustained the ark, the air, the wood, the spirits, and the tomorrow. As the ark floated above a submerged world, time seemed to stand still. Outside, all was silence, interrupted only by the sound of the waters. The earth had disappeared, swallowed by judgment. The sky, once blue, now remained overcast. But inside that wooden structure, sealed by God himself, there was life, order, and a daily rhythm that sustained the hope of a new creation. It was as if, amidst the chaos, the ark was the beating heart of humanity, beating steadily, sustained not by the strength of its walls, but by the presence of the eternal. Living with so many animals in a single family was challenging, not only physically, but also emotionally. The routine, which initially provided structure, soon proved essential to preserving the mental health of those who lived on the ship. There was a schedule of tasks, albeit rudimentary, with division of responsibilities. Each member of Noah's family knew what needed to be done, not out of obligation, but out of awareness of the vital role they played in that divine plan. Noah, as the head of the family and God's chosen man, led with gentleness and firmness. He oversaw the general well-being of the ship, ensuring that supplies were in order, that the animals received what they needed, and that all aspects of the ark's operation remained in balance. Shem, the eldest son, was responsible for maintaining the structural integrity of the ark, constantly inspecting the planks, adjusting the supports, and sealing weak spots. Ham and Japheth divided their time between distributing water, caring for the smaller animals, and transporting waste to the external reservoirs. The wives of the 3 sons, along with Noah's wife, performed equally fundamental functions. They prepared human food with preserved grains and fruits, kept the family's living areas clean, and helped feed the animals that required special attention: newborn chicks, smaller birds, and more fragile animals. It was constant work that required patience, organization, and mutual cooperation. Despite their discipline, the environment imposed pressures that were difficult to measure. The constant sound of the animals, the creaking of the wood under the movement of the water, the darkness of the endless nights, the smell of cramped living. All of this required emotional resistance. There were days when the silence of faith was the only force that kept them from becoming discouraged. But there were also moments of praise, prayers together, and memories of the promises that God had made. They gathered, even if only briefly, to strengthen their hearts with words of hope. There were no temples there, but there was worship. There were no altars, but there was daily sacrifice of dedication and perseverance. In the midst of this scenario, another essential element stood out: air. The survival of all the occupants of the ark depended on an effective ventilation system. The structure of the vessel included a long upper opening, known as a sohar, designed to allow light to enter and air to circulate. This system created a natural flow. The hot air, generated by the animals' bodies and internal activities, rose and left through this opening, while fresh air entered through the lower and sides, renewing the environment. Modern studies confirm that this model, despite being simple, was extremely efficient, using principles of thermal convection. And it is impressive to think that such knowledge was already embedded in the project that God gave to Noah. The internal structures, with well-distributed corridors and spaces, allowed this air to circulate through all the floors. There were, most likely, vertical gaps and small openings strategically positioned between the divisions, helping with the continuous oxygenation and dispersion of gases produced by animal respiration and the decomposition of waste. But the air system went beyond engineering. It symbolized something deeper, the breath of life. In a world where everything had been suffocated by water, God preserved the original breath of Eden within the ark. It was there, between wooden walls and resinous beams, that the air remained, pure, circulating among creatures that would soon repopulate the planet. In this sense, the ark was not just a vessel, it was a spiritual lung, a capsule of life awaiting the Creator's touch so it could breathe again on dry land. And so the days passed. The waters remained, but so did their trust. They did not know how much time remained. They had no way of measuring the days with any precision. But they observed signs. They felt the change in the air. They perceived the gentle calming of the waves. Everything indicated that the time of the promise was approaching. But until it was fulfilled, there was only one certainty: God was with them. This invisible but constant presence meant that the ark was not just a physical shelter, but a space for spiritual renewal. It was the place where the old world died and the new was born in silence, where obedience was cultivated with every simple gesture, where faith was strengthened with each day overcome, and where hope was the anchor cast not into the depths of the sea, but into the throne of God. The weeks stretched out like months inside the ark, and the months seemed to have no end. There were no windows to count the days, no clocks to mark time. The only calendar that existed was that of obedience, and the only compass was that of faith. While the world remained submerged under the waters of judgment, life inside that gigantic vessel continued its course, sustained by the discipline and constant care that Noah and his family dedicated to each living being entrusted to them. One of the most remarkable aspects of the ark's operation was its sturdy structure. At first glance, it looked like a simple, sturdy wooden box, but every measurement and material had a specific purpose. The proportions established by God, length 6 times greater than width and 5 times greater than height, ensured unparalleled stability even in the midst of the worst storms. Unlike modern vessels designed for speed, the ark was designed to endure, and it held firm, even in the face of the largest waves and the fury of waters that covered even the highest mountains on earth. The wood used, called gopher, combined with a thick layer of bitumen, served as natural insulation against humidity and external pressure. The ark's main beams crossed strategically, forming a lattice structure similar to those found on modern ships. This cellular construction distributed the impact of the water throughout the vessel, preventing a single point from being overloaded. What's more, the bitumen not only waterproofed the wood, but also gave it flexibility. Thus, instead of cracking or breaking under the impact of the waves, the ark absorbed the shocks, oscillating but never breaking apart. This seemingly simple architecture reveals a level of sophistication that surpasses the technical understanding of its time. For those who believe, there is no doubt, the hand of God himself was present in the project. It was he who gave the dimensions. It was he who indicated the materials. And it was he who taught, through the Spirit, how to apply each element, even without books or engineering manuals. The God who created the universe is also the architect of salvation. In addition to structural stability, another aspect required constant attention: environmental control. The ark housed not only animals from different climates, but also species with very specific thermal needs. Therefore, Noah and his family needed to wisely adjust the internal microenvironments. Some areas of the vessel were adapted to maintain greater humidity, using open reservoirs and stored vegetation. Others, drier and more airy, ensured comfort for species that did not tolerate heat or excessive humidity. The attention to detail was constant. It was like managing a miniature world, a mobile ecosystem floating on an endless ocean. And this world had to be in balance. A small mistake, an oversight, could have a ripple effect, but by God's grace everything remained stable. Cooperation among family members was vital. Everyone was aligned with the mission. There was no room for disputes or selfishness. The goal was greater than any difficulty: to preserve life, fulfill the purpose, and patiently wait for God's timing. Even the moments of rest were carefully planned. Physical fatigue was inevitable. But even more dangerous was the fatigue of the soul. Discouragement, a sense of isolation, a longing for the sun, the wind, the solid ground, all these haunted the thoughts. To combat this, there was singing, there was prayer, there was remembrance of the promises the Lord had made, and there was confidence that he who began the good work would complete it. The nights, though dark, were made more bearable when filled with praise. The soft light of the lamps reflected off the wooden walls, and the soft sounds of sleeping animals brought a kind of peace that can only be found when one rests in God's promises. It was not an external peace. The world was still, in judgment, but a peace that came from within, a spiritual rest, a certainty that despite the waters, God was still there. Over time, small changes began to emerge. The sound of the rain, which had previously fallen with constant fury, began to fade. The waves, which rocked the ark like a leaf in the wind, became softer, and then one day everything fell silent. The storm ceased. The sky, which had been overcast for so long, showed a slight opening in the clouds. It was not yet the end, but it was a sign, a whisper from heaven that the worst was over. Noah and his family did not know what was happening outside. They did not know what was left of the world, nor how long they would still be confined. But they knew that God had begun to act. The time of waiting was not yet over, but there were already signs that the time of the promise was approaching. And this was enough to renew their strength, lift their spirits, and move forward. The silence that fell over the waters after the storm was unlike any other. It was not the silence of fear nor of loneliness. It was the silence of hope. For the first time in a long time, the sky seemed to breathe again. The constant sound of rain had stopped. The thunder had stopped. The heavy clouds had slowly begun to dissipate. And although the world was still submerged, something had changed, as if creation were about to awaken from a long sleep. The ark, now resting on the waters, awaited the next movement of the sky. And Noah, even without seeing what was coming, knew God was about to open a new chapter in the history of humanity. After many days, something solid finally touched the bottom of the ark. It was a gentle shudder, as if the sacred ship had found rest. The ship had run aground on the top of a mountain, Ararat. None of those inside could clearly see what was happening outside, but they knew it was a milestone. The waters had begun to recede, not suddenly, but little by little, like everything God does with purpose and order. Still, it wasn't time to leave. The outside world was not ready yet. The ground remained waterlogged, conditions unstable, and God, who had ordered the entry, would also be the one who would say when it was time to leave. Until then, we had to keep waiting, and more than that, trust. Waiting became the ultimate test of faith, the one in which one no longer sees danger, but also does not yet see the promise fully revealed. It was during this time of silence that Noah took wise actions. He opened the upper window and released a raven. The bird flew back and forth, finding no place to rest. A few days later, he sent out a dove. It also returned, but on a new attempt, it brought an olive branch in its beak. That small, simple green branch spoke more than 1,000 words. Life had begun to sprout again. The earth, previously drowned by judgment, was now beginning to regenerate. The cycle of creation was beginning again before the eyes of a man who dared to believe. Finally, after a year and 10 days since the door was closed, God spoke again. The voice that had earlier commanded the building, that had given measurements, instructions, and promises, now rang out with tenderness and authority. Come out of the ark, thou and thy wife with thee, and thy sons wives. It was the end of the confinement. The ark had fulfilled its purpose. Life could begin again. And when he set foot on solid ground, Noah did not first think about planting or building houses. The first thing he did was to build an altar. There, on chosen stones, Noah offered a sacrifice to the Lord with some of the clean animals. It was a gesture of gratitude, of recognition, of consecration. It wasn't a request, it was a delivery. It was as if Noah was saying, "Everything we have belongs to the Lord. The life we have now is the fruit of your faithfulness." And God, upon receiving that sweet aroma, made a covenant. He promised never again to curse the ground because of man. He promised that the cycles of life, seeding and harvesting, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, would never again cease. As a visible sign of this covenant, God established the rainbow, a bridge of light between heaven and earth, an eternal reminder, not only to humanity, but also to God himself, that he would never again destroy the world with a flood. That rainbow of colors would be, for all generations, the mark of mercy triumphing over judgment. And even today, whenever a rainbow appears in the heavens, it speaks of the faithfulness of a God who keeps his promises. But the story of the ark is not just about the past. It is also a mirror of what is to come. For Jesus, when speaking of the last days, said that they would be as in the days of Noah. People would live their lives as if nothing were about to happen, eating, drinking, marrying, building, until suddenly the Son of Man would appear. And just as there was an ark then, so there is a place of refuge today, Christ. He is the true ark, the safety from the judgment to come. And those who abide in him, like Noah, will be preserved. Noah's ark is not an ancient legend, It is living proof that God judges sin, but also saves those who believe. It is a reminder that judgment may come, but grace always opens a door. It is the certainty that even when everything around us is lost, obedience and faith are still safe. And paths. Noah was not perfect, but he was faithful. He listened, obeyed, and waited, and because of that, life began again. Today, the ark rests in the memory of faith, in the heart of Scripture, and in the history of humanity. It is a symbol of hope, justice, covenant, and redemption.